I want to begin this video by saying I have a lot of respect for Camus. I've read most of his writings and he's certainly one of my favorite authors. It's fair to say that I wouldn't be the reader I am without him. Furthermore, this video isn't really an argument against his beliefs. In fact, one of the things I most appreciate about Camus is his allowance of contradictions, which he often seeks out in their most heightened state. Fundamentally, his philosophy of the absurd is one of contradictions. Today then, I'd like to point out some of these contradictions that I've come across while reading from Camus, and I'd like to do this through his perspective on the Algerian War. I would argue that it is through the lens of Algeria that we may see Camus' biases and contradictions at their peak to be extended outwards with all their manifold consequences. I have two aims in making this video. The first being to provide you with a, while not exhaustive, nonetheless relatively complete account of Camus' core formulation of absurdism. And secondly, to relate some of his more contradictory conceptions of the world, especially as they relate to Algeria. For those who don't already know, Albert Camus was a French-Algerian philosopher who, while often associated with the existentialists, created his own philosophical theory for what he termed the absurd. Importantly, I am by no means a Camus scholar or really all that well versed in philosophy, so if I make any minor mistakes, please forgive me. Camus, born in 1913, and writing primarily in the middle of the 20th century, was of course very influenced by the metaphysical philosophies established in the prior centuries. And it is within this branch of philosophy that his ideas lie. Concerned mostly with life and meaning, Camus asserts that our natural instinct is to want to search for the meaning of our existence. Questions of why are we here? What is our purpose? Is there a God? Things like that. We want to be able to understand the world and its workings as much as possible. The mind's deepest desire, even in its most elaborate operations, parallels man's unconscious feeling in the face of his universe. It is an insistence upon familiarity, an appetite for clarity. However, for Camus, we can never know if the world has any inherent meaning or unifying logic. And here stems forth our first contradiction. This divorce between man and his life, the actor and his setting, is properly the feeling of absurdity. Furthermore, Camus clarifies that it is not the world which is absurd, stating, "I said that the world is absurd, but I was too hasty. This world in itself is not reasonable. That is all that can be said. But what is absurd is the confrontation of this irrational and the wild longing for clarity, whose call echoes in the human heart. The absurd, then, is the contradiction between one's search for meaning and the apparently meaninglessness of the world around them." Camus declares, "The absurd depends as much on man as on the world." Camus then attempts to draw conclusions as to how life should be lived under awareness of the absurd. The irrational, human nostalgia, and the absurd that is born of their encounter. These are the three characters in the drama that must necessarily end with all the logic of which an existence is capable. Most important to Camus is preserving the terms and the contradictions of the absurd. For this reason, any philosophy or religion that imposes an undue order on the world negates the absurd, which in his opinion, one should not do. Of these beliefs, he says, "Everything is sacrificed here to the irrational, and the demand for clarity being conjured away, the absurd disappears with one of the terms of its comparison. The absurd man, on the other hand, does not undertake such a leveling process. He recognizes the struggle, does not absolutely scorn reason, and admits the irrational. Thus he again embraces in a single glance all the data of experience, and he is little inclined to leap before knowing." And again, this is one of the things I really appreciate about Camus. He embraces the nuances of the world. In his book, The Myth of Sisyphus, he draws three main conclusions from his philosophy of absurdism. The first relates to the question of suicide, and whether it is justified in a world devoid of all inherent meaning. As I alluded to earlier, Camus places value on upholding the tension of the absurd, and so ending one's life stops the absurd from existing, and this should be avoided. Living is keeping the absurd alive. Keeping it alive is, above all, contemplating it. Unlike Eurydice, the absurd dies only when we turn away from it. One of the only coherent philosophical positions is thus revolt. It is a constant confrontation between man and his own obscurity. Summed up, Camus states, "The absurd man can only drain everything to the bitter end and deplete himself. The absurd is his extreme tension, which he maintains constantly by solitary effort. For he knows that in that consciousness and in that day-to-day revolt, he gives proof to his only truth, which is defiance. This is a first consequence." So Camus dissuades suicide. Good. I think this is all a conclusion we can be happy about. Next, Camus discusses what our freedoms can be like in an absurd world. But first he shows how, without the concept of the absurd, and through using religion and other philosophies to derive meaning, one actually limits their freedom. To speak clearly, to the extent to which I hope, to which I worry about a truth that might be individual to me, about a way of being or creating, to the extent to which I arrange my life and prove thereby I accept its having meaning, I create for myself barriers between which I confine my life. Instead, by acknowledging only the truths of death and the absurd, one realizes that they are in essence completely free. I think of it in terms of the world and life are the only and everything we have. Camus says, "It is clear that death and the absurd are here the principles of the only reasonable freedom, that which a human heart can experience and live. This is a second consequence." Finally, Camus argues the importance of passion and the primacy of the present. He believes we should live as much as possible and have as many experiences as we can, regardless of how perfect those experiences may be. The present and the succession of presents before a constantly conscious soul is the ideal of the absurd man, the third consequence of his reasoning. Having started from an anguished awareness of the inhuman, the meditation on the absurd returns at the end of its itinerary to the very heart of the passionate flames of human revolt. Summing up his core philosophy, I'll end with the quote, "Thus I draw from the absurd three consequences, which are my revolt, my freedom, and my passion." And at its core, I ultimately agree with Camus. I personally find the philosophy of the absurd very liberating, and is probably the perspective on the world that has resonated with me the most. So I hope I was able to convey the broader message of it to you well enough. This, however, is actually not my main goal in making this video. Instead, I'd like to turn our attention to how Camus' particular philosophy and outlook on life manifests itself in the realm of politics, and show what, in my opinion, he gets wrong. To do this, I want to focus on his relation to the Algerian War for Independence of 1954 to 1962. However, much of his writing, and nearly all of his work, The Rebel, deals with his political as well as philosophical views, in which there are many more strange and ahistorical accounts given, but unfortunately these are a bit beyond the scope of this video. Now, of course, the Algerian War has many complex elements to it that I'll never be able to give justice to, but at the same time, and as Camus himself has taught us, I'll try not to shy away from these complexities. Camus certainly has an important perspective on the Algerian War, as he was born in the French colony of Algeria and witnessed the often horrific consequences of the French imperial system firsthand. The early history of France's presence in Algeria is one aspect that I'll mostly skip over, as I'm trying extremely hard to prevent this video from becoming one of those 2-hour-long video essays. But I think it suffices to say that, like in the case of other areas subjected to colonialism, France's move into the region in the mid-1800s was exploitative and brutal. From the very beginning, the Algerian people wished for an end to their oppression at the hands of the French. But at the same time, the French were quickly supplanting themselves into the region, becoming known as colons or settlers. Marshal of the early field campaigns to subjugate Algeria and subsequent governor of it, Thomas Robert Bugeaud stated, "Wherever there is fresh water and fertile land, there one must locate colons, without concerning oneself to whom these lands belong." While this practice was not uncommon in colonial areas, it sets the dramatic dynamic present throughout the history of French Algeria, in which almost everything controlled by the French living there came directly at the expense and from the exploitation of the native Algerians. These injustices were present throughout all aspects of life in Algeria, with heavily preferential rights being afforded to the Europeans living there, often referred to as pieds noirs. Importantly, while some of the native population were allowed to vote, these over 8 million Muslims were given the same amount of voting power as the only 1 million settlers, and furthermore, the government of Algeria was firmly contained within the broader French government, limiting their power even further. This is bad enough on its own, but it combined with the fact that, for all intents and purposes, the Muslim population of Algeria was barred from becoming French citizens, removing any hope of receiving the benefits being extracted from their own land. For a long while, the most basic demand of the Algerian people was simply for assimilation into the French system. But these efforts were frustrated each time, and it soon became clear that this fix would come far too late to stop the overwhelming flood of cries for independence. Always there to put a wrench into the hopes of reform were the pieds noirs, most of whom were fervently opposed to even the most modest offerings to Algeria's Muslims. Of course, it's impossible to overlook the role of World War II on the events in Algeria, as while France demanded the recruitment of the colony's population, their indispensable role in the war was hardly ever acknowledged and certainly never rewarded. As the future Prime Minister of independent Algeria and prominent figure within the FLN, or National Liberation Front, the primary political body fighting for Algeria's independence, Farhad Abbas put it at the time. The French colony only admits equality with Muslim Algeria on one level: sacrifice on the battlefields. This is ostensibly the context preceding the war fought by the native people of Algeria against the French colonizers, which broke out in late 1954. So where does Albert Camus fall in all of this? Well, as is often pointed out, Camus was among the Pieds Noirs of Algeria, born there in 1913 and also holding French citizenship. And while he was raised in a truly working class family, his father having been a farmhand at a vineyard and dying in the First World War before Camus was even 1, and his mother a cleaning lady, Camus' family roots are seated in the exploitative nature of settler colonialism in Algeria. Camus grew up in the coastal city of Algiers, gaining admittance to the University of Algiers and a bachelor's in philosophy. In the coming years, he would form his philosophy of absurdism and write many of the works for which he is known. Importantly, Camus was among the first French reporters to cover the plight of Algeria's oppressed, both the Arabs and poor settlers, touching on the subject periodically from 1939 until the outbreak of the Algerian War. He did this primarily by viewing it as a failure of France to respect its duties, a framing which I'll discuss more in detail later. However, as tensions rose in Algeria, Camus felt himself being silenced by, in his perspective, near overwhelming criticism by both those on the right and the left. While Camus is often seen as holding progressive beliefs, many on the left at the time felt betrayed by his frequent inability to throw his full support behind various leftist positions, and ultimately, this is exactly the case during the Algerian War. From the get-go, Camus himself acknowledges that he's likely blinded by his own biases. I emphasize the word experience, by which I mean a lengthy confrontation between a man and a situation, with all the errors, contradictions, and hesitations that such a confrontation implies, many examples of which can be found in the following pages. My opinion, moreover, is that people expect too much of writers in these matters, even, and perhaps especially, when the writers link to the fate of a country like Algeria by birth and emotion. It is wrong to think that he is in possession of any revealed truth, and his personal history, were it possible to write such a history truthfully, is but a history of successive failures, of obstacles overcome only to be encountered yet again. On this point, I am quite ready to acknowledge the inadequacies and errors of judgment that readers may detect in these pages. Therefore, it's not my intent to scold Camus for the mistakes he makes, only to inform us all to be conscious of his many contradictions, a concept which he himself places the utmost value on. On the surface, Camus was concerned with the use of terrorism against white Algerian settlers, a type of revolt he could never come to fully justify. Although, here is also where we come to one of the first contradictions. In some sense, Camus actually is able to understand the justification for these actions, writing, "Rebellion, contrary to current opinion, and though it springs from everything that is most strictly individualistic in a man, questions the very idea of the individual. The individual, in fact, accepts death and happens to die as a consequence of his act of rebellion. He demonstrates by doing so that he is willing to sacrifice himself for the sake of a common good, which he considers more important than his own destiny." I believe he acknowledges he may be wrong in his stance, as in the context of the Algerian War he states, "As for those who are familiar with it and yet continue to believe heroically that their brothers should die rather than their principles, I shall confine myself to admiring them from afar. I am not of their breed." Instead, as we will see time and time again, Camus rejects any sense of revolution, always favoring reform, arguing, "so that the family might at least survive and therefore preserve its opportunity to become more just." Here, the family to which Camus is referring to is French Algeria, and as we will come to see, it is only through these reforms to French-occupied Algeria that he can ever conceive of an end to the war. But again, Camus himself realizes the futility of reformism, especially when dictated by the whims of the French. Because French policy in Algeria ignored these elementary truths, it was always 20 years behind the actual situation. As a result of this, a plan that would have been welcomed enthusiastically in 1936 and would have solved a great many problems is today met with only wariness. Once again, we are too late. That is why, to believe my sample, Arab opinion is in its majority indifferent or hostile to the policy of assimilation. And for these exact reasons, the people of Algeria felt forced to take more drastic measures. Later he writes, "Solutions that might have been considered before August 20 are now out of the question. The elections that were once necessary and possible are now unimaginable without a ceasefire. The gulf between the two populations is widened. Extremists outdo one another in destruction. Reform will always be too little, will come too late, until armed revolution is the only path forward. Continuing on the theme of the FLN's attacks against the Pieds Noirs, Camus says, "Meanwhile, we must refuse to justify these methods on any grounds whatsoever, including effectiveness. Once one begins to justify them, even indirectly, no rules or values remain." And while I do not want to sound like I'm excusing the murders of innocent people committed by the FLN, I'm left with the question of if it's still wrong to destroy so-called values when the alternative is a world of oppression in which they will only ever be upheld for the lucky few. Furthermore, it's worth pointing out that the FLN proved to be a disciplined force as right-wing counterinsurgent groups carried out countless terror attacks to goad the FLNers into response, unsuccessfully. Returning to Camus' conception of his ideal state for Algeria, he comments, "An Algeria consisting of federated communities linked to France seems to me unquestionably preferable from the standpoint of justice to an Algeria linked to an Islamic empire that would subject the Arab people to additional misery and suffering and tear the French people of Algeria from their natural homeland." Camus approaches the topic of Algeria fundamentally, and very unfortunately, from a colonial mindset. He allows no room for an independent Algeria, maintaining the belief that the French should control a country they ostensibly have no right to control. In fact, he openly admits this stance, saying, "The desire to regain a life of dignity and freedom, the total loss of confidence in any political solution backed by France, and the romanticism of some very young and politically unsophisticated insurgents have led certain Algerian fighters and their leaders to demand national independence. No matter how favorable one is to Arab demands, it must be recognized that to demand national independence for Algeria is purely an emotional response to the situation." He states, and I honestly cannot wrap my head around this, "In a sense, the French have to conquer Algeria a second time." Throughout it all, Camus clings to a strange and naive sense of patriotism, arguing for those who demand reparations for the Algerian people because they want France to demonstrate that grandeur is not incompatible with justice. And here we get into Camus' more ahistorical readings of the world, seeming to honestly believe that France, as a nation and identity which necessitates colonialism and oppression, would ever be able to give Algeria the reparations it truly deserves. He even resorts to some of the most racist arguments in favor of colonial rule, claiming that it will bring progress and prosperity. Whatever one thinks of technological civilization, it alone, for all its weaknesses, is capable of bringing a decent life to the underdeveloped countries of the world. Materially speaking, the salvation of the East will come not from the East, but from the West, which will then itself draw nourishment from the civilization of the East. He even goes so far as to demand praise for colonialist powers relinquishing control over their exploited territories, in one of the most tone-deaf quotes I've read in recent memory. "It is pointless to condemn several centuries of European expansion, and absurd to curse Christopher Columbus and Marshal Lyautey in the same breath. The era of colonialism is over, and the only problem now is to draw the appropriate consequences. Furthermore, the West, which has granted independence to a dozen colonies in the past 10 years, deserves more respect and above all patience than Russia, which in the same period has colonized or placed under its implacable protection a dozen countries of great and ancient civilization. It is good for a nation to be strong enough in its traditions and honorable enough to find the courage to denounce its own errors, but it must not forget the reasons it may still have to think well of itself." Furthermore, Camus does not blame the Pieds Noirs, claiming, "The French of Algeria, who I thank you very much for pointing out are not all wealthy bloodsuckers, have been in Algeria for more than a century and number more than 1 million. That alone is enough to distinguish the Algerian problem from the problems of Tunisia and Morocco, where the French settlement is relatively small and recent." And yet, in nearly the same breath, he also remarks, "And wouldn't the French standard of living, as inadequate as it was, not have been worse but for the misery of millions of Arabs?" Showing his awareness that France and its settlers within Algeria were explicitly profiting off the exploitation and continued oppression of the Algerians. Still, he argues against the Pieds Noirs being made to repay their debts, insisting that they should remain in Algeria. And this brings me to one of the most pathetic arguments Camus makes against Algerian independence, and that's his belief that the FLN were demanding the expulsion of Pieds Noirs from an independent Algeria. A claim which, as we'll see, has no basis in reality. Those who advocate in deliberately vague terms negotiations with the FLN cannot be unaware that this would mean, according to the FLN's own statements, independence for Algeria under the rule of the most uncompromising leaders of the armed insurrection, and therefore the expulsion of 1.2 million Europeans from Algeria and the humiliation of millions of French citizens, with all the risks that such humiliation implies. These statements of the FLN to which Camus is referring to are the Summum Platform, drafted in 1956, outlining the aims and conduct of the Algerian Revolution, to which they would stay true through all the war. The platform, however, says nothing of the sort Camus claims, instead merely stating that the French present in Algeria would not be allowed dual Algerian and French citizenship, a far cry from the forced expulsion of the country's Europeans, as all Pieds Noirs who wished to remain in Algeria would be welcome and given Algerian citizenship. It seems then Camus was exploiting this issue in bad faith in order to preserve his wish for French-occupied Algeria. Moreover, the FLN was welcoming to all Pieds Noirs, save the worst offenders, announcing their aim to isolate the ultra-colonists by seeking the alliance of liberal elements of European or Jewish origin, even if their action is still timid or neutralist. For Camus, who often stated his desire to see the French and Arabs come together, a stance such as this should have been admirable. Ultimately then, I feel we are left with Camus' most heightened contradiction, creating its own form of absurdism with the problem of Algeria, and one that pervades most of his political thought, especially in The Rebel. This is the fact that, on the deepest level, Camus desires an agreeable, bloodless solution to Algeria's calls for independence, when it's abundantly clear that France would never allow this to happen. This is even reflected in his final, unfinished novel, The First Man. Writing on the legacy of Camus, Professor Edward Hughes observes that Camus' notes also referred to a native Algerian and European Algerian meeting in Saint Etienne, and to the fraternal bond between these two exiles living in France. With the Algeria of 1959 violently fractured, Camus, in what was to be his last novel, was willing into being a trans-ethnic, harmonious community. In effect, his writing was constructing a parallel world. And for a philosopher who never shied away from denouncing the idealism he often identified in the works of other thinkers, this sure sounds like a load of idealism to me. But perhaps this is to be expected from someone who, suffering from a decline in his mental health, attempted, in his words, to depoliticize the mind totally in order to humanize. Maybe then it's not entirely fair to criticize someone who is clouded by his own biases and wishing to escape the nuances that were causing him so much pain. But again, it's important to clarify Camus' stance to place his thinking within the broader perspective. Sadly, Camus would not live to see the end of the Algerian War, nor the subsequent independence its people gained in 1962, as he died early in 1960 in a car accident traveling in France. Would he have been happy with the terms of negotiation between Algeria and France? In the end, that's anyone's guess. But the undeniable fact remains that the strategy employed by the FLN led the Algerian people to their well-deserved freedom from colonial rule after 120 years of exploitation and 8 years of grueling war. Right as the war was ending, vast oil reserves were found in the Saharan extent of Algeria, a region previously ignored by France, which they were now funneling money into extracting the precious commodity, and which led the French powers to fight even more brutally for the continued oppression of Algeria, of course unsuccessfully. It is worth noting as well that the OAS, or Secret Armed Organization, the far-right paramilitary force comprised of ultra-colonist Pieds Noirs and responsible for countless horrific terrorist attacks on Algerian Muslims, is believed to have had ties with the CIA, which offered the OAS manpower and firepower in exchange for access to these oil reserves if colonial rule continued. As for the ultimate fate of the Pieds Noirs, over which Camus fretted so very much, true to their word, the FLN did not demand the expulsion of European settlers, only requiring renunciation of French citizenship in exchange for Algerian citizenship. Instead, it was the Pieds Noirs themselves who forcibly removed themselves from the independent country, in many cases destroying and abandoning their very connections to Algeria. Of the 1 million Pieds Noirs, only 30,000 made the choice to remain in Algeria, with many of those who fled's causes for concern being their own doing. With that, I hope to have been able to bring to light both some of the core beliefs which shaped Camus' thinking, as well as the ways in which they held him back in regards to Algerian independence. For a philosopher who's often heralded as a defender of justice and freedom, it's disappointing to see how he ended up betraying these ideals by clinging to near bastardizations of them. I hope this video has also brought to light the difficulties of seeing past one's own biases, an issue I certainly face myself. But you shouldn't expect too many more videos of this format from me, as it's my main wish to stick to videos about books. As I've said, I've come across a multitude of other weird takes by Camus, which unfortunately did not have time to cover in this video, so if you'd like me to make a follow-up diving into those, let me know. Or really, if there's any other topic you'd be interested in hearing my opinion on, I'd love to hear about them. Okay, this video's gone on long enough, so thank you very much for watching and have a great one.